For over an hour, storm chasers follow a terrifying killer as it decimates the Oklahoma countryside.
This is a big tornado, and it's headed right in the direction of Oklahoma City.
Moving to the northeast, over 1 million people lay in its path.
The threat was imminent, and it was a threat like they had probably not experienced.
As it levels entire neighborhoods, rescuers must try to save those in danger.
I knew people were dying. I didn't know how many, but I knew people were dying.
When nature unleashes its terrifying fury, underground is the only safe place to survive at F5. Every year, massive thunderstorms strike Oklahoma from March to July. Thunderstorms that can be a final warning of something much more dangerous to come. Tornadoes. During the afternoon of May 3rd, 1999, at the National Weather Service Forecast Office outside Oklahoma City, meteorologist David Andra was concerned because satellite imagery and Doppler radar showed a massive thunderstorm brewing.
We saw radar signatures that we know are associated with supercell thunderstorms, and those are the types of storms that produce the long-lived, long-track tornadoes.
He realized he had just enough time to issue a tornado warning.
Tornado warning is in effect until 7 p.m. for Oklahoma County. The storm is moving in from the southwest and should be arriving within the next 15 minutes.
On such a warm spring day, few Oklahoma City residents were worried about the possibility of a tornado. Yet the threat of a serious storm led the 4 p.m. news reports.
Good afternoon, glad you're here. I'm Kelly Ogle.
I'm Robin Marsh, glad you're with us this Monday, and we do begin with some potentially dangerous weather across Oklahoma today.
Here we go again. Gary's in the forecast center with the very latest. Gary?
Thank you, guys. Conditions are pretty favorable for some explosive thunderstorm development. In fact, some of that's going on right now. There's going to be a threat of severe thunderstorms, large hail, and the possibility of some tornadoes with these storms this evening.
In the Greenbrier Lake neighborhood south of Oklahoma City, Cecilia Vaughn and her mother Bobby, a school teacher, had just gotten home from work. Bobby was concentrating on grading a stack of test papers, while Cecilia was busy sending email. The TV was tuned to the news, but Bobby and Cecilia paid little attention. It was just background noise. Gary England is the best known of Oklahoma's weather forecasters. He's been Channel 9's meteorologist for 25 years. Even with the latest Doppler radar technology, he couldn't be certain that a tornado had touched down. England relied on storm tracker Val Castor to be his eyes and ears.
There's not a radar in existence that can tell you if a tornado's on the ground, but what you have to have is somebody out there that you can call or talk to on the radio and say, for example, Val Castor's one of ours. You can say, what do you see? It's absolutely critical.
Just after 5 p.m., Val saw his first funnel cloud near the tiny town of Cyril, 78 miles southwest of Oklahoma City.
We were out there before the first storms even developed. And we watched the very first storm go up that day. We watched it get stronger, become severe, and then put down a couple of bigger tornadoes after that.
Val's job was to give accurate, timely updates back to Gary at the Weather Center so the public could be warned. Over 1 million people lay directly in the path of the advancing bad weather. Most were still unaware of the rapidly growing danger.
relax, keep the TV on, we'll keep you advised. Now let's take a look at Viper, and we'll take a time lapse of it. Main storm right now, just now developing very quickly, and it's moving.
In southwest Oklahoma City, John and Dixie Szymanski were planning on a quiet evening home together. The television was tuned to Channel 9's Gary England, but neither John nor Dixie were worried by what was being reported.
I didn't know very much about tornadoes, being from New York. When I first moved here, I noticed the warnings and the watches on TV, and I'd paid attention to them when I got nervous the first couple times when I saw them. But then I grew accustomed to them, and I guess I became complacent and didn't pay much attention to them after that.
Zone 10, Snyder, update. What do you got, Val?
Okay, it looks like to me, Gary, this thing is rapidly getting organized. The rotation has gotten much stronger. We're probably 3/4 of a mile behind it right now. Gary, we have a tornado on the ground, a brief touchdown. It's 2 miles west of Chickasha, moving to the northeast.
Just after 5:30 p.m., the weather grew suddenly much more dangerous. A large tornado had touched down near the town of Chickasha, 45 miles southwest of the metropolitan area. It was now a violent F2 category tornado, almost 500 yards wide. People were unprepared as the tornado roared into the small downtown. The F scale, or Fujita scale, is used by meteorologists to rate the intensity of a tornado by examining the damage it causes to man-made structures. An F2 is considered a significant tornado with wind speeds up to 157 miles per hour. It was storm tracker Val Castor's first sight of the monster tornado that would soon terrorize Oklahoma City.
After we saw the third tornado that this storm produced, that was a stronger tornado. We knew then that this storm was probably going to get big.
But as quickly as it began, the tornado dissipated. This was not a good sign. Meteorologist Gary England.
The movement of the parent storm, the main thunderstorm, was generally northeast. Each time it cycled, it would strengthen, and then it would weaken. Every time it would strengthen again, the tornado would come down larger.
Val was transmitting photos of the approaching storm back to Channel 9. Using a global positioning system, he was able to give detailed locations of the storm's path. These photos were then broadcast live to viewers across Oklahoma.
So Val, let us know if this thing starts to come down again, because we're going to come back here.
After the tornado dissipated, a new wall cloud formed. That wall cloud was much, much bigger, had extremely strong rotation. At that point, we knew that was going to be a big tornado.
Air Force Reserve medical technician Scott Branscombe was trying to ignore the weather warnings and enjoy a quiet dinner with his family.
My mother and my sister were actually a little bit more concerned about the storm than me and my father were. But I wasn't too concerned. It's Oklahoma, it's May, we have tornadoes all the time, and just one of those things you get used to when you live in Oklahoma.
Within minutes, another tornado was spawned. Dirt and debris were sucked up inside as it slowly formed a trail of destruction.
Wow, that is absolutely awesome. This thing is throwing up debris all over the place.
If the tornado continued its present course, it would make a direct hit on Oklahoma City.
Like I say, this thing is just tearing things up. It's, like I say, the funnel is real small. I'd say the funnel might not be any wider than 100 yards.
What I can tell you folks here in central Oklahoma, just take your tornado precautions.
Even as Gary England pleaded with viewers to take cover, Bobby and Cecilia Vaughn continued to ignore the danger. Val had to zigzag through country roads to keep up with the tornado. As he drew closer and closer, he realized its deadly potential.
Yeah, we're getting active, working our way up. So now probably go down. It's huge. I'll tell you what, it's at least an F3 at this point.
It was now a violent F3 tornado with wind speeds up to 200 miles per hour. As the pictures were relayed live to the entire city, Channel 9 weatherman Gary England issued dramatic warnings to residents of southwest Oklahoma City.
Just talk to me about it. Once again, I will go through tornado precautions for you folks down there. Below ground is best. If you do not have below ground shelter, go to the center part of your house.
Oh, Mother, it's May.
Because no one could be certain exactly where the monster tornado would turn next, people were still reluctant to take any precautions.
Okay, so wait, but I can see a little bit of a clear spot working into it right now.
11-year-old Tim Bailey and his parents were heading south to their home after a day of shopping in Oklahoma City. They were unaware of the advancing storms. Meteorologist David Andra issued an emergency tornado statement in one more attempt to get people's attention.
Well, the tornado emergency statement we sent in an effort to heighten the public's awareness that this was an extremely dangerous situation. We wanted to make sure that everyone knew that the threat was imminent, and it was a threat like they had probably not experienced.
Medical personnel immediately prepared for the onslaught, according to Dr. Dale Askins.
We had excellent news reporting. We could see the size of the tornado around the Chickasha area moving towards Oklahoma City. So we knew it was coming. And preparing for that with the large number of casualties was our immediate concern.
Pillows, clothes, coats, anything you can find, and cover up. Stay away from the windows. This tornado is deadly. You need to be below ground to survive in most cases. It is moving.
Persistent warnings from the meteorologist finally stirred Bobby's interests. She now realized there was a tornado less than 3 miles from their home. Bobby told Cecilia that they must get into the bathroom.
They are deadly. About need to be at the low ground level to survive. Again, we need children that are home. A lot of pillows, a lot of blankets. They get in the bathroom, get in between the school and wall, pack them.
In the neighborhood of southwest Oklahoma City, the growing urgency of the weather warnings and panic calls from relatives had finally stirred John and Dixie Szymanski into action.
We realized the severity of the tornado when one of the local newscasters stated that if you weren't underground, you probably would not survive the tornado.
Val Castor continued north, following the storm that was now only a few miles from residential areas. Police blocked the roads from civilian traffic, and Gary England realized it was now an F5.
I had to say something to get everyone's attention because they've heard thousands of warnings, so I knew I had to say something to get their attention. That was get below ground. This is an extremely intense tornado. And I remember thinking then, a lot of people are going to die.
Oklahoma City braced itself for the full impact of the twister. On the late afternoon of May 3rd, 1999, a series of supercell thunderstorms spawned over a dozen tornadoes southwest of Oklahoma City. But storm tracker Val Castor realized he was not seeing a tornado that could be ignored.
Let me talk to Gary again.
He relayed his concerns about the twister's size and speed directly to Channel 9 meteorologist Gary England, who was broadcasting a minute-by-minute account of the tornado's deadly approach toward the city.
Gary could tell by the tone of my voice and what I was telling him that this was not an ordinary tornado. that this was a large and very devastating tornado. Hey, this thing is not letting up. This is a big tornado, and it's headed right in the direction of Oklahoma City.
As it continued northeast, the tornado moved away from small towns and rural areas. It was now heading directly toward Oklahoma City, where over 1 million people lived. Gary England was very concerned.
Looking at the tornado itself, the video of the tornado, talking to the meteorologist in the field, looking at it on radar, is obviously this was an extremely intense tornado. Didn't know the wind speed for sure, but it was 200 plus easy, and that meant it was probably going to blow away almost everything it encountered. Once I realized this particular tornado was different, I knew I was going to have to use a different type of warning. So what I said basically was, you're going to have to be below ground level to survive. I said, most houses are not going to survive this. So below ground shelter is best.
Unfortunately for many Oklahoma City residents, finding shelter underground was impossible. Although they were initially slow to react, school teacher Bobby Vaughn and her daughter Cecilia had taken cover in their bathroom. Pillows were all they had time to grab, and became their only protection against the impending storm. In the neighborhood of southwest Oklahoma City, John and Dixie Szymanski had taken shelter in their closet. For 5 long minutes they waited, clinging to each other. The announcements on the television plotted the tornado's grim march toward their new home.
Dixie and I were talking about how much we loved each other just before it hit. We were praying.
In the span of 20 miles, as the tornado moved from the rural community of Chickasha to the more developed subdivision of Bridge Creek, it had grown to be almost a mile wide. It had also evolved into the most lethal classification on the tornado scale, an F5 with 300-mile-per-hour winds.
The tornado appeared to reach its maximum intensity about 318 miles an hour. Usually a hook echo on radar indicates a tornado is filled with precipitation. The hook echo was filled full of houses and debris and cars in the air. It was a horrific experience because I knew people were dying. I didn't know how many, but I knew people were dying.
As tornado sirens began going off around them, Scott Branscombe and his family realized their home lay directly in the tornado's path. With no basement, they knew the next best thing was to take shelter in an interior room or a bathtub. To cover them from falling debris, Scott and his father dragged a mattress into the bathtub.
But it was just get everybody, into the bathroom, get everybody safe, and just get ready for what may or may not happen.
11-year-old Tim Bailey and his parents were driving home when they saw the tornado out of their window. They jumped out of their car and ran up to an overpass beneath the interstate, thinking it was a safe place to take cover from the storm. The tornado had been zigzagging as it moved into the city, complicating accurate prediction.
Gary.
Yes.
We're back within about half to 3/4 of a mile of it now. It's directly north of us.
Yes.
I think it's on the interstate right now.
Tim Bailey crawled into the overpass for shelter. His mother protected him with her own body. She held on as long as she could while the tornado blew right over them. As emergency vehicles responded, it was difficult to determine the full extent of the damage the tornado had left behind in its wake. Scott Branscombe and his family now feared the worst. With the sound of the storm now a deafening roar, Bobby and Cecilia Vaughn could do nothing but wrap their pillows tighter around their heads. At 6:40 p.m., the big twister hit the neighborhood of Moore. A swirling cloud of razor-sharp debris, it shredded everything in its path. As it crossed the interstate highway, the mile-wide tornado made a direct hit on John Szymanski's new home.
Right as it hit, we felt a strong sensation of wind and air at our feet. At that point, I knew we were probably going to be in some trouble, just due to the fact that we're in an interior room. There was no ventilation in the closet coming from the floorboards. At that point, we realized that the house was coming apart and it was disintegrating around us.
As the massive tornado finally hit, the Szymanski's home exploded, and his young wife's hand was torn from his grip. On May 3rd, 1999, an F5 tornado with 300-mile-an-hour winds slammed into the suburbs surrounding Oklahoma City. It destroyed everything in its path. For storm chaser Val Castor, a mile-wide tornado was a frightening sight.
We were probably about a half a mile away from the tornado, and I looked out the windshield and looked straight up, and there was a large piece of debris. I don't know what it was. Could have been a car, could have been a roof of a house, but it was straight above us, about a half a mile up in the air.
It crossed the interstate, leaving a trail of death and debris in its wake. No one had seen anything like it before. Meteorologist David Andrew was among them.
This was the first time that I can recall that I genuinely had some personal fear or fear for my family or friends that they were in the path of a long-track, violent tornado.
Rescue personnel were beginning to realize how violent and dangerous it was.
I mean, we got hurt. We got 2 hurt, we got 1 missing. Okay.
Tim Bailey was dazed. His father was injured. His mother was missing. She had held on to him as long as she could, but when the tornado threatened to consume them both, she let go to save her son. EMT Jeremy Walker was one of the first on the scene.
The boy appeared to be in shock about everything that had just happened, and he continued to be that way pretty much the whole ride to the hospital.
As the tornado moved past the interstate into the heavily populated metro area of Oklahoma City, over 1 million people lay in its path. Air Force Reserve medical technician Scott Branscombe and his family had taken cover in the bathroom. For many Oklahoma City residents, an interior room was their only protection. With the tornado almost upon them, Scott couldn't resist one final look outside. Now, barely 500 yards away, came a coal-black wall of swirling debris. The noise was deafening.
I went outside and turned back and saw this black twisting wall, just this black mass, and it was just unbelievable. I couldn't find the words to explain what it exactly looked like. It was just a big black wall of noise.
But his parents' home lay in the possible path of the tornado. As they took shelter in their bathroom, they could hear the thundering sound of the twister approaching their home.
Sounded like a freight train or a jet engine revving up just in our backyard. It was amazing. I saw it, and I just didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know if it was going to hit us, go around us. And I can remember everyone just being really, just kind of almost nauseous. You have absolutely no control over anything that's about to happen to you. And that's kind of a sickening feeling when you can hear it, and you just don't really know what to feel.
The approaching roar swallowed up the cries of Bobby and Cecilia Vaughn. The mother and daughter were now witnessing the storm's full fury. News helicopters continued to report as explosions and power flashes erupted throughout the city.
Jack, get us back on the air.
Even Channel 9 went off the air.
It's huge.
Images were coming in so quickly that Gary England and his weather team found it difficult to keep up.
It was a horrific day. I've been in this business 30 years, and I'd never seen anything like that. I always knew someday an F5 would come through the metro, but I had no idea it would be that big and that vicious.
The F5 continued its trek, leaving southwest Oklahoma City devastated. Of 50 brand new houses in the Szymanski's neighborhood, not one survived. John Szymanski was blasted 50 feet from his house. Now, he was desperately hunting for his missing wife. Storm tracker Val Castor was stunned by the devastation.
The damage was just incredible. I have never seen damage that bad before. There was well-built brick homes completely leveled, swept clean off their foundations. Cars were so mangled that you couldn't even recognize them. They didn't even look like a car. There was axles laying out in the road. There was bricks and parts of houses and boards and 2x4s, just all kinds of debris just strewn all across the countryside.
Cecilia Vaughn had survived the tornado unharmed, but her home had been completely destroyed. The only thing still standing in its original position was the bathtub she rode out the storm in. She quickly realized that her mother, Bobby, was nowhere in sight.
Dixie!
I was praying that she was alive. When we were laying in the closet, I was trying to hold on to her. When the house got, blown away from around us, I wasn't able to hold on to her any longer.
I could hear boards breaking and glass crashing, and right after that, it got very quiet, and when I lifted my head up, everything was just gone.
In the 911 dispatch center, Frank Gresh tried to coordinate rescue personnel to the hardest hit areas.
People were calling on their cellular phones and didn't know where they were calling from because there were no more landmarks, there were no street signs, there were no houses, there were no house numbers. There was nothing there to help them identify where they were calling from and where we needed to send ambulances to get people the help that they needed.
As the tornado continued moving northeast, leveling the surrounding areas, emergency response crews moved into action. Knowing there were people who needed immediate medical treatment, off-duty paramedic Steve Swoyer ran throughout his neighborhood, trying to help in any way possible. He had run less than half a block from his home when he heard a woman screaming. She was standing in the remains of her home and pointing toward a mattress covered by bricks and wood. The woman told him that her little girl was trapped underneath.
You could hear her crying underneath. She was scared. And that whenever we deal with kids, crying is a good thing. Crying means that they're breathing, their heart's beating. When they stop crying, that's when you got to worry about, okay, what happened? What's changed?
Swoyer checked for any injuries and handed the girl back to her still terrified mother. The tornado had passed within a couple of 100 feet of the Branscombs' untouched home. Scott knew there was an apartment complex nearby where there could be many more injured.
Dixie!
Across the region, desperate citizens searched for missing family members. John Szymanski finally located his wife, Dixie. When the tornado hit, its brute force blasted her from his grip, throwing her 70 feet into the neighbor's yard.
Help!
He didn't know if she was dead or alive.
As I got closer to her and I got some of the debris off the top of her, she wasn't responding to any of the questions I had for her. When I was yelling her name, she wasn't responding at all to me.
Cecilia Vaughn continued to search for her mother. She found her buried under the remains of the bathroom walls. As Cecilia tried to get her free, Bobby lost consciousness. Within minutes after John discovered Dixie, a police car came through the neighborhood. The officer told him an ambulance was headed toward them. He helped John move Dixie out of the debris and onto the curb. Cecilia Vaughn's cries for help were finally answered by paramedic Steve Swoyer. She had survived the tornado, but her mother Bobby was buried under the rubble, unconscious. Swoyer could see that she was severely injured and close to death. He knew he had to get her to the hospital, and soon.
She was scared to death. To see her mom like that, it's a heartbreaking experience. To have a loved one, and all of a sudden, 5 minutes ago, you're sitting, talking, laughing, and then 5 minutes later, they're close to death.
Even if Steve Swoyer managed to keep Bobby Vaughn alive, he still had to get her to the hospital, which was 7 miles away. But emergency services were overwhelmed. Roads were blocked by debris, and thousands of people lay buried, waiting for help to arrive. On May 3rd, 1999, an F5 tornado ripped through the heart of Oklahoma City, destroying whole communities. Storm tracker Val Castor had driven over 80 miles pursuing the tornado and issuing reports to News 9's Gary England.
More debris, yeah. Oh, big time.
As the tornado finally began to move away from the city, Castor realized the severity of the devastation around him.
I knew that I had to do my job and relay warnings, relay information back to Gary about the tornado. You've got friends and relatives that live all over Oklahoma City and more. So, yeah, I'm trying to do my job, but at the same time, I'm worrying about my friends and relatives, worrying how it's going to affect them.
In his own battered neighborhood of Greenbrier Lake in southwest Oklahoma City, Steve Swoyer was attempting to rescue Bobby Vaughn. She was very badly injured, her lungs filled with blood and fluid. Passing firefighters assisted him in removing the rubble from around Bobby and strapping her onto a backboard. Unfortunately, they couldn't help him transport her to the hospital. Swoyer was on his own.
I figured ambulances were coming. I figured there'd be more help coming. I didn't know the extent of the damage. I figured it was just our neighborhood.
Steve Swoyer was now in a race against time. He knew he wouldn't be able to help Bobby much longer. Miraculously, passing motorist Gary Miller stopped and offered them a ride to the hospital. Miller had been on his way to teach at a local college when the tornado struck. Now the professor helped Steve and Cecilia load Bobby onto his Jeep. With Swoyer kneeling over Bobby in the back, they took off. A stunned Gary England watched in disbelief as the tornado's rampage ended as suddenly as it had begun. The main storm dissipated shortly after crossing over the heart of Oklahoma City, but the terrible damage had already been done.
It looked like a war had been fought. There were areas where there was just a foundation left. There were cars that were the size of a small desk. Even as you looked at it, it was hard to say, my gosh, this happened, this moved through. How could anything do this?
Scott Branscombe had reached one of the worst-hit areas of Oklahoma City. The big tornado scored a direct hit on an apartment complex in Moore.
It was just completely leveled. There was boards and chairs and cars, and you just close. It was unbelievable. I had never seen anything like that before in my life.
Branscombe drove half a mile from his home looking for survivors.
Oh, is there anyone here? Hello?
10 minutes into the search, he heard someone screaming. Scott reached down into the rubble and discovered an elderly woman lying on her back.
Okay, good. Okay. Hey, somebody!
He called out for assistance.
There's a lady inside here. We need to get her out.
As Scott and the rescuers moved the debris off the woman, they discovered that the walls had collapsed right on top of her. But she was partially protected by her walker.
When she had fallen down, that walker had fallen on top of her, forming a brace, keeping all of that stuff and that huge wall and all that debris from basically crushing her to death.
Finally, Scott Branscombe was able to lift the walker away. He placed a C-collar around her neck to keep it from moving.
She told me that she had been through 2 world wars, a depression, and 13 or so presidents, and she said, you just go ahead and pull me on out here. She said, I've been through worse.
He and the rescuers then laid her upon a piece of plywood and carried her to a staging area that had been set up in the middle of the street.
We could hear the sirens, obviously from all directions, because there's so many damaged areas, but we knew that they were on their way. They were going to be here as fast as they could, because people had cell phones and people had radios. So we knew they were on their way. We knew help was definitely coming.
Across southern Oklahoma City, thousands of citizens and emergency rescue workers were now combing through the debris and rubble, searching for family and friends. John Szymanski had managed to get an ambulance for his injured wife. Dixie was unconscious, clinging to life by the frailest of threads.
Just as the ambulance pulled up to treat Dixie, they advised me that they were going to treat the most serious patients first that they found in the addition. They began speaking with each other and they decided they were going to transport Dixie first. So I realized it was probably pretty bad at that time.
In the back of the ambulance, John Szymanski assisted paramedics as they tried to stabilize Dixie. She was unconscious. Her neck was broken. Blood seeped from her crushed face. John Szymanski feared the end might now be very close for his young wife. At Hillcrest Health Center, 100 injured survivors arrived in the first hour by any means possible. Dr. Dale Askins, head of emergency services.
We started receiving victims prior to the tornado hitting Oklahoma City because they were transporting them out of the communities south of us. So we were immediately aware we had a real disaster on our hands with the number of victims that started coming.
When she arrived, Dixie Szymanski was among those with the highest priority for immediate medical attention. John could do nothing more for his wife now, but wait for the doctors to tell him her fate. The supercells that created the F5 tornado continued to form dozens of new ones as the storm moved off to the northeast.
Find the basement in the building.
As night fell, the damage transformed the landscape of Oklahoma City into a surreal scene. Burning gas lines and houses illuminated the night sky. The Jeep with Bobby Vaughn wound its way to the hospital through piles of debris. Steve Swoyer was trying to keep Bobby alive. He knew his limited equipment would sustain her for only so long. He asked Cecilia for help.
I told her to assist her ventilations, and I also told her to talk to her. The last sense to go is your hearing. I knew that her mom was in there. We still had a good strong pulse at that time, but the respirations were dying.
With the sounds of chaos all around them, they navigated the nearly impassable roads, hoping they could get to the hospital in time. On May 3rd, 1999, a terrifying F5 tornado plowed into Oklahoma City. It was the most destructive tornado outbreak in U.S. history. Paramedic Steve Swoyer had rescued Bobby Vaughn from her home. Her condition was critical. Her daughter Cecilia hoped Professor Miller could get them there in time. Now, as they neared Hillcrest Hospital, it appeared their efforts were in vain. Bobby had stopped breathing.
As we got there, Steve jumped out of the back of the Jeep and started giving all the statistics on her that he could give, and they rushed her into the emergency room. But I knew she had quit breathing when they took her in.
The blast from the tornado had crushed Bobby under the walls of her home, knocking her unconscious. Her collarbone, nose, and several ribs were broken. Blood and fluid filled her lungs. She had stopped breathing.
She never regained consciousness, and I kept trying to get her to respond and telling her to hang in there, but she never did respond.
As the emergency room filled to capacity, Dr. Dale Askins had to deal with a growing list of physical as well as emotional medical conditions.
All these patients were psychologically traumatized as well as suffering their physical injuries. People were agitated, anxious, frightened, covered with mud. Virtually everybody was bleeding from multiple lacerations, punctures, that type of injury.
After an exhausting 4-hour search trying to locate survivors, Air Force Reserve Medical Technician Scott Branscombe got the word to return to Tinker Air Force Base. The enormous military facility narrowly escaped disaster as the tornado swerved at the last moment. In the tornado's aftermath, the military opened their arms to the local community, sending search and rescue teams into the tornado-damaged areas and providing food and shelter for survivors. Scott was assigned the duty of assisting many of the tornado victims. Thousands had lost their homes. Cecilia Vaughn got news that her mother would live. She'd gotten to the hospital just in time.
Even while she was in intensive care, every time she would wake up, she would ask where she was and what had happened, and we would retell the story of the tornado, and that she had a broken shoulder and broken ribs, and she just didn't have any recall of anything that had happened.
John Szymanski finally got to see his injured wife. Dixie barely recognized him, and she couldn't talk. Her broken neck was in a brace for 6 months. Doctors began a grueling marathon of 13 surgeries in an attempt to repair her shattered face.
I believe that 160 stitches in her head, and that's the first time I got a chance to see, and she was still covered in dirt and in blood.
4 days after the tornado, paramedic Steve Swoyer returned to work. But not before he paid a surprise visit to Bobby Vaughn.
It was a happy time, a real emotional happy time, because here we have someone that could have been left for dead, could have not been with their family today. And being able to be part of it was a good feeling, to know that, I was able to help somebody.
In the aftermath of the May 1999 tornado outbreak, the federal government declared Oklahoma City and the surrounding towns a disaster area. Entire neighborhoods had been leveled. An estimated 10,000 residents were now homeless. 1 million cubic yards of debris littered a 27-mile corridor of destruction. Between 30 and 40,000 vehicles had been damaged or destroyed. Almost 800 people were injured. There were 44 fatalities. Incredibly, the death toll from the nation's most destructive tornado outbreak might have been worse. Meteorologist Gary England knows that people without protection from such damaging storms might not be so lucky again.
It might be in 1 year, it might be in 10 years, it might be in 50 years. It is going to happen again, and people will need somewhere to go. So people that don't have the plan, don't have the safe room, don't have the place to go, are at risk.
Both Dixie and John have healed from their injuries. In December of 1999, they moved into a new home. 1 year later, Dixie gave birth to a baby girl, Maya. To protect them all, they have added a special feature, a storm cellar. Dixie knows life is a gift.
And we're just lucky to be here and enjoy it as while we're here, because you never know when your time is.
The people of Oklahoma City have once again learned that lesson. It is a lesson for all of us.